Hello, everyone. My name is Nestor Suarez. I'm a writer and scholar from Argentina. And on this channel, I create content about literature and literary studies, both in Spanish and English. Today, I'd like to bring you an analysis of my most recent read, Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. I decided to reread this novel as I was reading up on early 20th century American history. I've always felt more drawn to the 19th century classics like Poe, Hawthorne, Melville, and to the modernists that rose to prominence in the 1930s, the likes of Faulkner and Dos Passos. When it comes to the early decades of the 20th century, however, I have to admit they've always felt like unfamiliar ground to me, with the sole exception of Lovecraft's weird fiction, which I have read extensively. So I decided it was high time to revisit the literature of the period, and what better point of departure than the works of the first American to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. Main Street was Lewis's first significant commercial success. It sold over 180,000 copies within just 6 months and went on to become the best selling novel in the first quarter of the 20th century. Lewis's experience as a journalist and editor had given him a keen sensitivity to the tastes and expectations of a mass audience, in particular those of women, who made up the bulk of the novel reading public. So it's no surprise that the book went on to become a landmark of American literature right from the start. However, the novel that was published in 1920 was a far cry from its original conception. Lewis had been experimenting with tone, searching for a narrative voice that could convey criticism with conviction, but without going over the top in a way that would alienate readers. In the early drafts, the narrator sounded overly sarcastic and condescending. As the writing process progressed, Lewis began to tone down some of his criticism, adopting a more restrained stance. Instead of openly editorializing, he decided to filter his critiques through Carroll's inner thoughts and let the villagers expose their flaws through their own words and actions, which made the satire feel more organic and less heavy handed. Interestingly, the main character had been supposed to be a man modeled after the author himself. However, Lewis changed his mind after visiting Sauk Center, his hometown in Minnesota, in the company of his wife, Grace, who was a cultured New Yorker, well read, refined. Seeing Sauk Center through her eyes enabled Lewis to gain a whole new perspective on the town, prompting him to write Carol as an outsider. It's fair to say that Carrie was partially inspired by Grace, who, by the way, did a lot of proofreading when her husband was working on the book. She played a very important role in the making of the novel, not only as a muse, but also as a literary collaborator. Main Street has always been lauded as a satirical commentary on life in small town America. It's a profound exploration of small town politics, where influence and power circulate subtly, and every neighbor clings to whatever little authority they have. The novel enacts a negotiation of the tension between resistance and conformity, a tendency to embrace mediocrity and settle for stagnation, which the text creatively calls the village virus. This has always been the traditional take on the novel, but while it's easy to see Main Street's value as a social document, it is also easy to overlook its formal virtues. That is, how Lewis managed to craft this powerful narrative. My main goal in making this video is to discuss some of the strategies that the author mobilized in order to dramatize Carol's sense of claustrophobia. Because I believe that the novel is mostly about entrapment. Entrapment as an all encompassing force, spatial, social, psychological, and even bodily. Carol's efforts to modernize Gopher Prairie are met with polite apathy, condescension, and even derision. She feels hemmed in by the geography of the town, its vast flatness. The houses she visits feel claustrophobic, conversations loop endlessly and meaninglessly, and even pregnancy becomes a form of captivity. Entrapment in Main Street is slow, banal, and soul crushing. And that, perhaps, is what makes it all the more terrifying, the way it masquerades as a normality. One of the most subversive aspects of Main Street is its raw portrayal of motherhood as a form of entrapment rather than fulfillment. I'm not in a position to determine how controversial this might have seemed to contemporary readers, but I, for one, was certainly shocked by the sheer brutality of Lewis's depiction of pregnancy in the novel, which I would like to illustrate by reading the following passage. Each morning she was nauseated, chilly, bedraggled, and certain that she would never again be attractive. Each twilight she was afraid. She did not feel exalted, but unkempt and furious. The period of daily sickness crawled into an endless time of boredom. It became difficult for her to move about, and she raged that she, who had been slim and light-footed, should have to lean on a stick and be heartily commented upon by street gossips. She was encircled by greasy eyes. Every matron hinted, "Now that you're going to be a mother, dearie, you'll get over all those ideas of yours and settle down." She felt that willy-nilly she was being initiated into the assembly of housekeepers. With the baby for hostage, she would never escape. Presently, she would be drinking coffee and rocking and talking about diapers. There is nothing sacred or redemptive here, just a relentless erosion of Carol's sense of self. The imagery is visceral: greasy eyes, a baby as hostage, the domestic sphere conceived of as a prison. This scene is no exception, though. In fact, Lewis repeatedly uses Gothic imagery to translate Carol Kennicott's internal sense of claustrophobia into something spatial, physical, and haunting. Now, I'm not suggesting that Main Street might be considered a Gothic novel. Rather, I mean that Lewis deploys Gothic devices to heighten Carol's growing dread of domestic confinement. In one of the most striking passages in the novel, Carol perceives the furniture in the house she moved into right after getting married as a circle of elderly judges, condemning her to death by smothering. The anthropomorphized objects seemed to close in on her. Their oppressive presence echoed in the brocade chair's imagined whisper. "Choke her! Choke her! Smother her!" This invocation of inanimate objects as malevolent agents underscores Carrie's profound alienation. The domestic sphere is not a site of warmth, it is a grave. The old linen smelled of the tomb. Social life offers no relief. At a local gathering, Carol discovered that conversation did not exist. The guests sat up with gaiety as with a corpse, a phrase that simultaneously ridicules their performance of sociability and reveals the emotional deadness of the town. Even intimacy becomes tainted. When Carol is lying in bed, she looks at the footboard, and the narrator tells us that she saw the footboard as the footstone of the grave of love. The bed an emblem of conjugal life, is reframed as a sepulchre. Through these Gothic distortions, Lewis doesn't merely aestheticize Carol's discontent, he amplifies it. The grotesque imagery dramatizes her entrapment in a world that crushes vitality. Ultimately, what's terrifying is not the supernatural, but the stifling normality of everyday life. Satire alone does not account for Main Street's unprecedented success. It also stemmed from its technical brilliance in translating social critique into narrative craft. The novel's subversive depiction of motherhood and its unflinching portrayal of entrapment likely struck a deep chord with post World War I America, a society grappling with rapid social change, shifting gender roles, and the disillusionment of modernity.